Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Some of those items are true. The rest of them are stretched, but I want you to keep your expectations very low. As I've said to a number of people, I very much enjoy winning races, particularly when the hurdles are about 3 inches tall and I can leap over them and look super heroic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, what we do, and some lessons that we've learned about public policy. And I'm going to do it on a stages of 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to give you one definition. I'm going to talk about 2 meetings. I'm going to talk about 3 channels. And I'm going to give you 4 lessons. So if I get to the 3rd part and I forget about the 4th part, you remind me, it's 4, get to the 4th part. But first I need to explain this John stuff. There's a lot of Johns in the introduction. There's a joke to be made there somewhere, but leave it out. My name is John Hood. I run the John Pope Foundation. I used to run the John Locke Foundation. John Locke Foundation is a think tank. The John Pope Foundation is a philanthropy. The Pope Foundation is a little over 30 years old family foundation. We have about $200 million in assets, and we give away $10 to $11 million a year. Most of our giving is in public policy. Most of it is in North Carolina. But we also do a number of national programs and have relationships with lots of the national conservative and libertarian organizations with which you're familiar. But because John Pope was a North Carolinian and built his chain of retail stores, which is now one of the largest privately held retail chains in the United States, but it started in North Carolina. We have a lot of affection for our home state, and we do focus a lot of our efforts on it unabashedly. The first time I met John Pope, I had been working in Washington here at the New Republic at the tail end of the Reagan administration, and was going to go back to North Carolina to help start what became the John Locke Foundation, a state policy think tank. And I was given the directions to the location, and I kept driving by this warehouse with this prefab building in front of it, thinking, where is the headquarters of this major company? And finally, it occurred to me I should stop into this prefab building and ask. I thought it was a construction shed or something, and I was going to ask whoever was inside to tell me where I could find Mr. Pope. And I walked in, and there was Mr. Pope. This was his office. He was an unassuming fellow. He was extremely successful because he cared about costs. He was literally in the 5 and dime business. And he's a competitor. His stores compete with Walmart at the top end and Family Dollar and Dollar General, so forth at the bottom end. He passed away in 2006. So I met him and was very puzzled that this was, I wasn't sure at the time this was really the person who had the wherewithal to make this happen, at which point we went behind the prefab building to his Rolls Royce. The first and only time I've ever ridden in a Rolls Royce. Got into the car with Mr. Pope and his son Art Pope, who's currently our chairman of the foundation. And they proceeded to debate for, I don't know, Morton, maybe 10 minutes about which of the 2 Chinese buffet places near the office was cheapest. And the difference in cost per person was, I think, 20 cents. And right there, you're getting the point. Right there, it occurred to me why these guys had a Rolls Royce. Because they worked in volume and very small margins and making decisions on the basis, of course, this was their money, but on the basis of how do we maximize value for not just every dollar we spend, but every dime that we spend. And that's the philosophy that I found very congenial. My middle name is McDonald. I'm very Scottish. And so we got along famously. Actually, it turned out that my twin brother had already worked for them. He had been one of the first program officers for the Pope Foundation when he was a student. And so Hoods have been conspiring with Popes for a long time. All right, so I told you I was going to give you one definition. So I might cheat a little bit. I'm going to give you this definition of politics. And I should tell you something that was left out of the introduction, and I'm a little upset with Angel for leaving this out, is that I am a committed Marxist. I believe that Marx had an unparalleled understanding of human nature and of society and of how government works. In fact, he defined politics as the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and prescribing the wrong remedies. This was, of course, Groucho Marx, who, as I said, had a peerless understanding. Groucho also used to say when he was giving speeches, he would say, before I give you my speech, I have something important to say. So what I want to give, before I get into the substance of the discussion about politics and public policy, we need to define it. I'm going to cheat a little bit and get away from Marx's definition and talk a little bit about the definition of conservative politics. And I think the simplest way to describe that is the way Margaret Thatcher once did when she simply said, the facts of life are conservative. That's it. The point being, conservatism, and if you think about it, it's an alliance. It's an amalgam of some very different strains of thought, from traditionalists to libertarians to hawks. What binds this sort of unwieldy coalition together is an acceptance of reality as it is. Now, that is not to say that one accepts the current state of affairs as, well, this is the best we can do. That's not at all what this means. As Francis Bacon said, nature, in order to be commanded, must be obeyed. In other words, if you want to make a change in human affairs, you need to start with something that is unchangeable, which is human nature. And if you think about it, all of the strands of conservative thought take as their starting point something that is unchanging. If you're a traditionalist or a social conservative, you believe there are certain virtues or traditions or institutions that have proven themselves over time to be valuable and enduring and supportive of human flourishing. If you're a libertarian, a free marketeer, you believe there are certain inescapable facts of life. Scarcity, desire to make something better for yourselves and your family, which we call self-interest, but it's actually not just about the self, it's about something broader than the self. And these are inescapable realities. You may want things to be the same that they were 20 years ago, but technology's changed. People have gone on and done something different, and you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's unchangeable. And similarly, if you're a foreign policy conservative, if you're a hawk, you recognize that we can dream all day long and make up songs about imagine no national borders and no heaven and no hell and things like that. But the reality is that the world is populated by people who want to steal you and knock you over the head and take your stuff. And so you better protect yourself. It's just part of reality. So my definition of conservative politics is the practice of the facts of life, applying them to reality. Now, I told you I was going to tell you about two meetings. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that y'all are here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I don't begrudge you that. It's important to do that. But I don't live here anymore, thank goodness. I live in my home state. I'm involved mostly in the state think tank movement across the country. I'm on the board of the State Policy Network, which was created, and I was there in 1992, as a kind of a trade association for the state level conservative and libertarian groups across the country, of which I think at last count there are 66. When you talk about how things happened at the state level, not surprisingly, it comes back to Ronald Reagan. Sort of directly and sort of indirectly. I'm going to tell you two quick stories that happened roughly the same time. After the 1984 election, which Ronald Reagan won convincingly, didn't pick up Minnesota, but, it was pretty good. But actually, that cycle was disappointing for Republicans in a number of ways. The number of House seats gained in 1984, I think it was 16, which is not particularly, for a landslide presidential win, this was underwhelming. The number of governorships they picked up was precisely 1. And there were lots of people very puzzled by this who were Republicans. Why can't we do better down the ballot? We can reelect a president, we can control the U.S. Senate, we can have some gains in the House, but we're not going to get anywhere close to a majority in the House playing this way. And at the state level, Republicans were largely irrelevant in most of the country. 2/3 of governors, more than 2/3 of legislatures, actually more than two-thirds of governors, after the 84 election were Democrats. And so down the ballot, Republicans, except in a few places, seemed incapable of being competitive. So a number of people decided to do something about it. How can we transfer this success at the national level into success at the state level? They had a meeting in East Tennessee. It was actually called by a fellow whose name you recognize, Lamar Alexander. He was then the governor of Tennessee, the second two-term Republican governor, probably I think the first two-term Republican governor of Tennessee. The place they met is now on the Lamar Alexander Parkway in East Tennessee at a place called Blackberry Farm. He called the meeting with the National Governors Association, or the Republican Governors Association, and a group of Republicans in the House called the Conservative Opportunity Society. So I'm going to give you the names of the people. There were only a few people at this meeting, and most of these you will recognize. The two leaders of the Republican Governors Association were Dick Thornburgh of Pennsylvania, John Sununu of New Hampshire. There were three members of the Conservative Opportunity Society who were there, a guy named Connie Mack, who later became U.S. Senator from Florida. He was a congressman at the time. Another congressman named Carroll Campbell, who later became governor of South Carolina, and a former professor at West Georgia College, Tulane University grad, Newt Gingrich, for whom nothing much was heard after that. Actually, one of the attendees at the meeting told me that Newt Gingrich was then the way he is now. He had about 100 ideas. They were coming out constantly. About 90 of them, not sure about. The other 10 were brilliant. So they had this meeting, and they actually had some other people there, too, whose names you would recognize, but I won't get into the details. But those were the key members of the meeting, and there was one other leader there, a friend of mine, Jim Martin. He was the newly elected governor of North Carolina. He had been in the Conservative Opportunity Society as a member of Congress for 12 years. So he was the one person, he was actually the senior statesman in the room. He had the most political experience, and he had been in the House, and now he was a governor, so he bridged the gap. And what they worked on here, by the way, Trent Lott was supposed to be there, but I think he got delayed by the weather or something, so he didn't get there. This was a very important meeting. And out of the meeting, they came up with several strategies for recruiting candidates for state and local office, training them to do well, giving them something to say. One of the points that Lamar Alexander made was, we're great at talking about, the Soviet Union and federal budget and tax cuts, and when people say, well, what are you going to do about schools? What are you going to do about the roads? What are you going to do about the trash collection? We don't have anything to say except freedom, the Soviet Union's bad, So they had to come up with a message for how conservatives would govern if they were state legislative majorities or governors or mayors or city council members or county commissioners. And so they worked on that. They created the Southern Republican Exchange. Newt Gingrich left and took over something Pete DuPont had started about 10 years earlier called GOPAC. And Newt Gingrich rejuvenated that and really focused on training people, talking to people about running for state office, which he knew would eventually lead to people running for Congress out of those offices. Lamar Alexander, Jim Martin, and other Republican governors started sharing back and forth. They recruited some strong candidates, and they focused on state affairs for the first time in a long time that Republicans had done that. So 1986 comes along, and 1986 was not a good Republican year. Republicans lost the U.S. Senate. This typically happens in midterms, as the president the party not in power, and the White House tends to take a bath. By the way, this is also likely in 2018. Don't get too concerned about it. It's just the nature of politics. It goes back and forth. So 86 in general was not a Republican year, but they gained 8 governorships, hundreds of state legislative seats, even though they shouldn't have. And the reason is they had focused on this very carefully. And after this, with GOPAC and with other institutions that were created or rejuvenated during this time, Republicans never let up paying attention to state and local affairs. Had a big jump in 1994. Republicans took over lots of governorships, legislatures they previously hadn't had, and it's ebbed and flowed but over the years. But today, 2/3 of legislatures are Republican, 2/3 of governors are Republican. It's a dramatic reversal from where it was in the 1980s. I care about the country. We all live in the same country. I care about the presidency and Congress and so forth. But for me, Washington is not the whole story. And a big part of our story is that Republicans, who were once a distinct minority in state capitals and local governments, are now the majority party for the first time since the 1920s. Now, parallel to this was another meeting, actually a set of meetings, but the key meeting was in 1986. This was at the Madison Hotel, which is in Washington, and it was a meeting of a new group of state-level conservative organizations. They called themselves the Madison Group because they were meeting at the Madison Hotel. A few years later, we changed its name to the State Policy Network, but it was the association of what was then, I think, 4 or 5 conservative think tanks, and I said now 66. Similar to the political developments in the ideological and the conservative movement, the focus was, again, here we are talking about federalism and devolving power to the states and how important communities are, and Washington is too big. And then all the conservatives and all the libertarians, when they get out of college, they move to Washington. And they spend all their time talking about what's happening in Washington. And this was a conscious effort to steer some of the resources, human and financial, back to communities, back to states. This was something that Ronald Reagan actually suggested to one of his supporters, Tom Rowe, a friend of mine who was a founder of the South Carolina Policy Council. And Tom was the driving force behind the creation of the State Policy Network. And he did this because Reagan had said, wouldn't it be great if we had heritage foundations in every state, which we now do, by the way. So these two sets of meetings were critically important. They gave conservatives the opportunity to make policy in the states and to learn in the state context how successful policy is made. So I want to very quickly get to the point of 3 channels. There are 3 ways that you can influence policymakers, as far as I know in my experience. And I'm going to give them to you in the descending order of importance. The most important channel is the direct, face-to-face, unmediated relationship between you as an activist or a think tanker or a conservative leader, the private sector, and a public official. Direct personal communication. Now, this is so obvious, and why it's wasting our time. But the truth is, lots of people ignore the fact that politics and policy is a human enterprise. It's about people who know each other. I can't tell you the number of people that I've met who are smart conservatives, who know a great deal, who are really good writers. And I would go to these national conventions and I would ask them, well, now, who's your finance chairman in the state Senate? And they would say, I don't know. Well, then you're irrelevant. How well do you know the governor or the governor's top aides or at least a cabinet secretary? Well, I've never had the pleasure of meeting them, but one day you're out. This is about personal relationships. Now, admittedly, it's harder in Washington. It's not that hard, honestly, if you are a good activist in a state capital or in local government. You can meet and have relationships with policymakers. This is by far the most valuable investment you can make. Just talked to one of my fellow North Carolinians who's about to run for the state house. Keep this in mind, is that this is a people business, and the people that you meet, the lobbyists that walk into your room, into your office every day, actually they are valuable resources. If you understand where they're coming from and who they're arguing for, they're a tremendous source of information and often advice. As long as you keep your own counsel, I'll talk about that in a second. So direct communication is the most important thing. It's not always possible. So the next generation down, the second channel, is indirect influence through opinion leaders. Opinion leaders are sort of idea brokers. They're relationship brokers. They're in every state. In Washington, there are certain kinds of power players who used to be in office, or they fund people who are in office, or they lobby people who are in office, or they cover people who are in office, and they play these outsized roles as opinion leaders, we call them. They used to be called elites in the political science literature, but people got upset about elites, and so they changed the name to opinion leader. But that's what we're talking about. There are people who have disproportionate influence on policy. And so the next best thing to knowing a governor is to know the governor's best friend. Next best thing to knowing a legislature is knowing the legislator's business partner or the publisher of the newspaper the legislator reads. One thing I found, we ultimately lost this battle, but for about 15 years in North Carolina, we held off a state-run lottery. And we had a whole strategy session, I think every week or 2 weeks, on how to make this happen. And we had all these different strategies, and there was a left and right coalition, by the way. We had very liberal activists who were with us on this, that we didn't all agree about the reasons we didn't want the government in the lottery business, but we all agreed we didn't want the government lottery. And one of the things we found that was sort of obvious, but it took us a while to figure out, is get to know the state senator's minister. Who does that person turn to for advice, and have a relationship with that person? So opinion leaders, tremendously important. The third level is indirect influence through grassroots activism. Many LI programs are aimed at grassroots activism. I'm not a grassroots activist per se, but I've been involved in those efforts and funding those efforts for a long time. It's a valuable investment. It is the least effective of the three. Now, you want to play in all three games. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying what grassroots is particularly effective at is stopping things. It's a little bit harder to use grassroots to get things to happen, but it is a very valuable tool for making things not happen. And as conservatives, grounded in the facts of reality, we know that most new ideas are bad. If they were good ideas, someone would have already done them, right? So there are good ideas that we want to make happen, but most ideas that politicians come up with are really deeply stupid, and we want to stop them. So grassroots activism is a particularly valuable tool for doing that. And the truth is that any effective conservative movement has all three of these games playing at the same time. You have personal relationships with policymakers. And by the way, there are some implications of this that sometimes people that I hire and people that I know and people that I'm friendly with are uncomfortable. Say, well, this means that if they're with you on three issues and then they go horribly wrong on the fourth issue, you can't burn them. You criticize them, but you don't say that you're dead to me. This is really a poor advice for how to be effective in the long run. You don't burn bridges, even with people that disappoint you, because the next time they might be with you again. Doesn't mean you spare, you still criticize, you say what you mean. People will respect you if you're honest and say what you mean and don't just always try to tell them, just flatter them. And all. Politicians are not dumb people. They can spot that. So if you're going to influence them, you absolutely share when you're disappointed with them, but you don't make any particular vote the end of the relationship if your goal is, in the long run, to build a relationship that leads to public policy success. So there are implications there, and in fact, there are tensions. Sometimes grassroots activism creates certain kinds of images or terms or descriptions that then make it hard when you walk into the room and say, didn't you call me a commie last week? Why should I listen to you? And the answer to that is plausible deniability. But just make sure you have a number of different organizations. No, that was David Hood, his twin brother. Actually, I have a twin brother named David. I blame him all the time. I said, no, that was David. It wasn't me. Exactly. We look the same. But he's a lawyer, so he's a little better fed. So he's got about 15, 20 pounds on me. All right. So those are the three channels. Now, 4 quick lessons that I have learned either from doing usually the wrong thing and then learning from it, or talking to people who have been successful when it comes to public policy, advancing public policy at any level. It could be Congress, it could be states, it could be localities. The first one is dream big, start small. If you don't have a big, audacious vision for change, no one is going to follow you anywhere. I dream that one day in our town where Democrats beat us 4-1, we will be beaten by 3-1. This is not a big, audacious dream. On the other hand, if you were to organize, actually, this is literally what happened. My friend Jim Martin, who eventually became the governor of North Carolina, he was a professor of chemistry at Davidson. He had a PhD from Princeton in organic chemistry. Ultimately, by the way, when he was in Congress in the 70s, he was instrumental in saving Sweet and Low, saccharin. He and Teddy Kennedy, by the way, allied to save. Teddy Kennedy was no stranger to sugar, as it turns out. But they did save saccharin. Anyway, when he was a professor at Davidson, he really was tasked with, they were losing the particular town. It was a very liberal college town in North Carolina. They were losing, the Republicans were losing 4-1. And in a subsequent election, they really did just lose 3-1. And that was actually a step towards something good. In other words, the dream is not to lose by 3-1. But if you go from 4-1 to 3-1 to 2-1, you are moving in the right direction. So have a big audacious dream, motivate people, but don't also promise, and by the next election we will be in charge, or the Social Security will be privatized, or the flat tax will be passed or something. If you have a goal, a long-term goal that's audacious, great. If you then insist on immediately winning everything you want, you will dispirit your followers. They will lose interest. So there's a calibration here between have a big goal, but we're willing to get there in stages. Pretty much everything that is useful has been done in stages. Again, we as conservatives recognize, even when we are trying to change things, there is a certain natural status quo bias that people have. They're comfortable with what they have. You're trying to get them to do something different. We do want to do that. You might have to get there in stages. That's okay. Second lesson is yearn to learn. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. None of us can know everything. But I guarantee you there's lots of important things that you don't know sitting here today, no matter how old you are and how much experience you have. The politicians that I know that are successful in the long run are always learning. Political activists that I know that are successful in the long run are always learning. They are curious people. They want to know new things. One of the things I can tell about young people, whether they're going to be successful, is do they ask me lots and lots of questions. Now, this annoys me sometimes. But if they don't ask me questions, if they don't express curiosity, it's kind of a warning sign. And with politics in particular, there's always something to learn. The technology of politics is constantly changing. That's not how we did it back in my day. We've all said that. We've all probably meant that, but that's not necessarily a good sign. Yeah, okay. Well, that isn't the way we did it back in the old days, and that's not how we do it now. We have to learn new things constantly. The third lesson is engage before you wed. Now, this is excellent marital advice, but that's not quite what I mean. What I mean by this, and I'm very serious about this in today's context, you need to figure out how to engage people that you don't agree with. There is no reason why politics and political conversation and public policy debate has to be Armageddon, as Nancy Pelosi said the other day. Just a silly claim. The tax cut might be bad, it might be good. It's not Armageddon, it'll never be Armageddon. But the point is, if you can't imagine why somebody disagrees with you, you will not be successful. I don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump. I don't know anybody who voted for Hillary Clinton. That's a bad sign, isn't it? Don't you all know people who voted for one or the other? I do. Okay? And the truth is, human beings are rich, complex creatures, and you can learn things from people who have very different political views from you. At the very least, you can learn why they think the way we think. If you're trying to persuade someone, you better be able to make their argument in your head, or you'll never be able to win the argument. And the point I mean by engage before you wed is, don't wed yourself to any particular strategy, any particular goal or bill until you have a clear sense of why somebody else would be against it. If you can't imagine why anybody would ever be against this bill that has never passed, you will fail. So engage before you wed is good advice. And when politicians do it, when they engage effectively across the aisle, learning from others, I'm not talking about selling out your principles or becoming a mush. I just mean if you know people in the Congress or legislatures and they don't have a good friend from the other side of the aisle, that's also a bad sign. That person is probably unlikely to succeed. If our goal is to succeed and not just to say we're playing the game, one of the ways you succeed is you deeply understand your opponents. One of the best ways to do that is to actually befriend one. It's okay. We're not going to be excommunicated. It's okay. And also, by the way, we ought to be able to have conversations about our political differences and not get into shouting matches and insults. I'm deeply offended by this. I think we as conservatives should be offended by this. We are often the targets of this kind of behavior, and returning fire, it strikes me, is not the right answer here. It's to seek something better than that. Finally, kind of related to that, this is my fourth lesson. I did get through all the numbers. What's right is rarely wrong. Now, I could mean what's right with a capital R, and that's of course true. Conservatism is rarely wrong. But that's not quite what I mean here. What I mean is when you do things according to your principles, what you believe to be right, in the long run, most of the time, this is in your personal self-interest. This will save you lots and lots of heartache. Human life is a complicated enterprise. We all have tough choices. We often make mistakes. We're fallen creatures. We make mistakes. We yield to temptations. But the truth is that sometimes we make things overly complicated. Well, I know this is the right thing to do, but it will cost me something. It will make me unpopular. It might affect my next election, and therefore I won't do it. This is a mistake. Do what you think is right, and more often than not, over the long run, it will work out for itself. It truly will. I'll give you my favorite example, again, from my friend Jim Martin, the former governor of North Carolina, his career. He was chair of the county commission in North Carolina's largest county in the late 60s when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And they decided they didn't want to have riots in Charlotte as had been around the rest of the country, and so they had a series of public meetings where they had people express their grief or anger or whatever. And in one of these meetings, Jim Martin, the conservative Republican who was running the county commission, said, we've got to do something about racial discrimination. It's wrong. We need to take some action in housing and so forth. So he did that. It was politically costly, but he did it, and it was the right thing to do in his mind. So a few years later, he was running for Congress in 1972, and there was a powerful local Charlotte business magnate. He actually ran Lance Snack Food Company, which is based in Charlotte, snack crackers and so forth. His name was Philip Van Everett. He was this sort of big burly guy with the eyebrows, and he had been a former Charlotte mayor and a big conservative Democrat. So he called Jim Martin in and had Martin sit in this couch that was probably a little collapsed. So Martin was sort of looking up at this big burly guy looking over him, and he said, I remember that you came out for open housing. Anti-discrimination. Martin said, yes, sir, that's my position. He said, is that still your position? Are you still for open housing? So Martin sort of knew this was, he guessed this would be bad, but he said, yes, sir, I'm not going to change my view. At which point Van Everett told him he would support him for Congress. His family would support him. His business associates would support him. He'd raise the money necessary. He would elect him to Congress. That's exactly what happened. Now, here's the interesting part of the story. Philip Van Everett was I'm from Charlotte. He was sort of in my grandfather's generation about race. He was not a progressive man on race. He was a traditional segregationist. So he did not agree with Jim Martin on the question at hand. He disagreed with Martin. The reason why he supported him is he appreciated someone who could stand up to pressure. And his point was, if most of the politicians who come into my office, they just tell me what I want to hear. And I know that if they go off to Raleigh or Washington or whatever, they're just going to be easily played by the first lobbyist that comes by. They have no fixed principles. I don't like to support people who have no principles. I don't agree with some of your principles, he says, but I'm going to support you because you have some. And that was something that Martin learned that I think we can all learn, which is that you cannot, this is a good sort of Hayekian conservative insight about economics to end on, which is it is impossible for any of us to have all the information we need to project all the permutations and all the possibilities of every decision that we make. It is beyond the capacity of anybody other than God to have that information. So when someone says, well, we're going to sit down and we're going to map out all these and we're going to know exactly, we'll diagram and pull up data and blah, 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 blah. I'm not against planning, but there's some inherent uncertainty about what are the consequences of your decisions. When he made that decision to come out against discrimination, he couldn't predict the political consequences. He didn't try to predict the political consequences. He simply did what he thought was right. It ended up being very much in his political interest. And I think that that's a very important lesson for all of us is do what you think is right. First of all, if you tell the truth, it's easier to keep your story straight. It is really hard to remember all the lies you tell. The truth is easy. And similarly, if you do what you think is right based upon principles you deeply believe in, it's harder to get lost. And in politics and public policy, and I don't just mean people who serve in office, okay? I've seen people who work in conservative activism be corrupted. And it is typically because what becomes important to them is scoring a grant from the Pope Foundation or whatever, or getting popular. And they get away from their principles, and a lot of times that ends in disaster because they haven't stuck to their principles. So that's the way I would, I gave you one definition and 2 meetings and 3 channels and 4 lessons. That's 10 things. There are 10 commandments. There are 10 parts of the Bill of Rights. I think I should stop right there. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.